Warm welcome to today's webinar on climate change and gender. My name is Mats Engman, and I will be your moderator today. And we are looking forward to a very interesting webinar, I can assure you. I will start with a few welcome words before we let our speakers take to the floor. Within the overall framework of our ongoing effort to explore various aspects of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, in today's webinar, we would like to closer examine gender and climate security aspects to promote inclusive peace and strengthen global partnerships. Today's webinar is a collaborative effort between the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP, and the Korea Women's Development Institute, KWDI, with the generous support from the Korea Foundation. And this is the third event in our series examining various aspects of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And from ISDP, I would like to thank KWDI and Dr. Yoon for an outstanding support and cooperation in preparing for this webinar. I believe we all share a concern and can directly, on a personal basis, feel and relate to the changes to our climate and environment. Some areas are affected more, requiring almost crisis-like actions like flooding, and other areas with rather limited immediate impact but long-term consequences. In many parts of the world, the impact of climate change, like rising temperatures, droughts, flooding, etc., often causes increased competition over the resources, fuels migration, and calls for displacement of people and even entire villages, exacerbating conditions that threaten peace and security, both in small societies, villages, and entire nations, in fact. Pre-existing gender norms and power structures may deepen inequality and leave certain groups disproportionately affected and vulnerable. Against this backdrop, today's webinar aims to provide an overview of ongoing efforts to integrate climate issues within the existing Women, Peace and Security agenda, and to review the lessons learned from these experiences. Additionally, the webinar will discuss strategies to build and strengthen global partnerships to promote inclusive and sustainable peace. And to guide us in this complex web, we have three fantastic speakers, and I will introduce them one by one as they make their presentations. Our three speakers will make a presentations for about 10 to 12 minutes. And if you want to ask questions, which I encourage you to do, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will make my best to try to take as many questions as possible. Our first speaker today is Ms. Claire Hawkins. She is a Women, Peace and Security expert currently working in the Asian Pacific region, supporting UN Women to develop a guidance paper on integrating climate change into national action plans on women, peace and security. She has over 14 years of experience in this field, and her work has taken her to positions in Geneva, New York, as well as on the ground in Kenya, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. Ms. Hawkins has also worked with the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund in Geneva, coordinating the rapid response window on women's participation in peace process. Among her many field missions, she supported the development and implementation of the Ugandan National Action Plan on the Security Council Resolution 1325. Please, Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Max, for that very kind introduction. Very nice to be with you all this morning or this afternoon. So I'd like to start off by kind of feeding into what Max has already started in terms of why are we talking about women, peace and security when it comes to climate change. And first of all, why women, peace and security? the agenda itself, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, has really now more keenly integrated climate change, acknowledging that it's one of the top security conflict threats in the world. And there's been resolutions passed by the Security Council specifically talking about climate change and in regards to women, peace and security, acknowledging both the disproportionate impacts on women and girls, but also the transformative power of their leadership across peace and climate action, and the transformative impact that it can have on both agendas by having women, peace and security and climate change closely entwined. So this is really where national action plans come in. They've been highlighted time and time again as a really key tool to integrate peace and security goals of different agendas. And that could be agendas around countering violent extremism. It could be around humanitarian disasters or many other issues, and climate change is more and more seen as a critical peace and security issue. So these national action plans have been seen as a really great tool to integrate climate change, once they are designed explicitly to do so. They provide a very practical and appropriate mechanism, unlike really any other tool that is available, through which government and civil society can collaborate together on very vital peace and security matters. And national action plans can create space for civil society, governments, and multilateral institutes to work together in service of a very shared vision when they collaborate. It's seen as national action plans to date are seen as probably one of the most concrete approaches to utilize and address the nexus of gender, climate change, peace and security. And we're seeing that their inclusion of references to climate change in National Action Plan has really been increasing over the years. And most recently, there was an analysis done, and that was 2 years ago, so I'm sure it's increased even more so. Back in 2022, 43 out of the 107 existing national action plans make reference to climate change. So that's 40%. I think it's now up to about 45%. And then 6 out of 13 regional action plans make reference to climate change. And so we really see when we talk to practitioners on the ground that climate change is a really key priority and issue and threat when it comes to peace and security. And it's up there as one of the critical issues. So at the moment, like Mats has said, I'm working with UN Women supporting the regional office for Asia and Pacific to consolidate good practices and develop a guidance tool for practitioners on how to integrate climate change into women, peace and security national action plans. We're only halfway through this project at the moment. We're hoping to be finished soon enough. But the idea is that we draw from practices both regionally and globally to develop a resource that will be wide-reaching relevance and utility. Because we're seeing that climate change often hits an impasse in the narrative and doesn't really move beyond that into implementation due to largely lack of understanding of how this can be done. So we've just concluded about 30 consultations from across government, civil society, youth, donors, the security sector, academia, practitioners. And so far we're seeing really great practical examples of how different countries have integrated climate change into their women, peace and security national action plans in various ways. For example, in the Philippines, there's a really great example of how climate change has been integrated by identifying solutions through a climate and gender lens across the different pillars of the National Action Plan. And there are many, many other examples that I can talk about of how countries like Philippines, Uganda, Finland, and many other countries have taken a really holistic approach to integrating climate change across the National Action Plan outcomes. And so finally, I'll just mention some of the really kind of key trends that are emerging. Consultations have revealed, these consultations that we've been doing over the past couple of months have really revealed some really great examples of good practices and challenges in integrating climate change. Some of these have been, the success factors have been political will, stakeholder engagement, making sure that all of the actors that are involved in climate change and peace and security are coming together on the national action plans, cross-sectoral collaboration, as well as evidence-based advocacy. And I can talk a bit more about this as the session unfolds. So maybe just to mention that that there's been really great while there's been really great progress, there's also been challenges around lack of accountability, challenges in taking climate change through from the narrative section of a national action plan to the monitoring and evaluation framework. And that normally is around lack of understanding of how it can be practically integrated and implemented, as well as challenges around coordination, capacity building and awareness raising on the linkages between climate change. So this points to the need for increased capacity building to create awareness of that linkage. Some great ways to address these challenges that have come up have been tracking government expenditure and establishing a secretariat to help with coordination, and developing narrative reporting and indicators. These are some experience that have come up, but also localization and ensuring that lived experiences are documented throughout through the National Action Plan is also really critical. So this is just some examples, and I can talk a bit more in the Q&A session. I'd be happy to talk about more examples that have come up. So I'll hand back over to you, Max. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claire, for providing us with this understanding of the importance of the national action plans and getting this, from theory into practice, if I may say so. And I'm sure we will come back to that during our Q&A session and discussion. So moving forward to our next speaker, Charlotte dos Santos Pruth. She has over 2 decades of experience working with development cooperation and women's rights, and the last 14 years with the Kvinna to Kvinna Foundation here in Sweden. During 3 years prior to this assignment to Kvinna, she worked in Northeast Brazil with a non-governmental organization organizing rural workers with a focus on women and youth. During her years at Kvinna to Kvinna, Charlotte developed policies and advocacy strategies on civic space, economic gender justice, and the nexus of gender, ECC, and conflict. Charlotte has a background as a journalist and holds a master in communications for development. So please, Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Claire. Really interesting to hear the work on the National Action Plan's integration of environment and climate crisis. So, and thank you all for listening in. I wanted to start my presentation by saying a few words about Kvinna to Kvinna and how we have worked on the topic of environment and climate crisis, and then a few things about what we see and what our partner organizations see when it comes to this nexus that we are talking about today. But maybe just to start by saying that the Kvinna to Kvinna Foundation, we are a civil society organization, a Swedish foundation, and we support women's rights organizations in conflict-affected countries. And we've been doing so for around 30 years now. We support 140 women's rights organizations, and we work in the South Caucasus region, in Ukraine, in the Middle East and North Africa, the Western Balkans, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And since we support women's rights organizations in conflict-affected countries, several years back now, we saw the need to also engage in environment and climate issues, since we saw that it was affecting heavily both women's lives, but also conflict and violence. So we started discussing with our partner organizations how we could best support them, how we could strategize together, etc., in order to bring a gender perspective into climate and environment crisis processes, decision-making, funding, etc. And initially, in the beginning, I would say that partner organizations, women's rights organizations that we talked to, felt we did a study in the MENA region where we looked at the feminist movement in MENA, which is one of the eldest, one of the strongest social movements in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa region. We wanted to see how it engaged, if it engaged with environment and climate issues, and if not, why. And even though I think over 60% of respondents to our survey said that they thought this was a priority area for a feminist movement, very few of the organizations actually engaged in this topic. And this was for several reasons. One being they felt that they lacked technical capacity to engage. It was difficult to engage because women are underrepresented in the different fora where decisions are made, but also due to competing priorities. So I wanted to read a quote actually from a Egyptian activist, women's rights activist and environmental activist from Egypt, where she said that it feels like living in a hospital's emergency room-like society. There are overlapping priorities. And in light of a political reality that requires silence and caution, and an emergency situation where women are exposed to daily physical violence, it may look that talking about something like climate appears to be a luxury. So it was seen as an area to engage in that was maybe not priority because there are so many other urgent issues. But I should say that in the past few years, maybe 2-3 years since the pandemic, this has definitely changed. More and more of our partner organizations, women's rights organizations, are engaging in and require support to engage in environmental and crisis decision-making issues, policy practice, etc. And we believe that this is both due to the fact that the crisis is becoming more acute. It definitely affects the daily lives of women, but it's also, and maybe this is linked to what Claire said, it's a topic that the nexus of environment and climate crisis, conflict, and women's rights is becoming more discussed on international global policy levels. And also, of course, the fact that the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, had this as their priority theme a couple of years back, also helped to bring the attention to the women's rights organizations. But one thing that they do say still is that they find it difficult, and I think this is also something that linked to what you said, it's a bit difficult to translate this nexus into practical issues still, and that's something I think we need to work on. I want to say a few things about what we have seen in terms of the gendered aspects for women's rights of ECC in conflict-affected countries. But before I do that, I just wanted to state like 3 things that I think are important factors always to bear in mind when we discuss this nexus. And the first one is, and you touched upon that, I think, Claire, that women are the first, in many cases, to be impacted by climate change. And we see that very, very clearly. Women are often in agriculture, they're often small farmers, they often lack the means to adapt and to mitigate And they are also often in the forefront of small-scale environmental projects, like, for example, tree planting. The other thing that we need to remember is that the climate crisis is unfolding in a deeply unequal patriarchal world, which means that in many contexts, women are underrepresented in the decision-making fora where discussions on ECC is taking place. And the third one I want to just mention also is the lack of resources, that women have far from the resources that men have. They don't own their land, etc. And this, of course, also affects their vulnerability to climate crisis. I hope you will stop me, Mats, if I'm going too far, but I wanted to say a few of the things that we've seen. We did a study in Rwanda a couple of years back, where we looked at the role of women's rights organizations in conflict-affected countries, or in Rwanda, sorry, to deal with environment and climate crisis, but also the effects of climate crisis to women in Rwanda. And this study was based on, we did 34 key informant interviews, but we also did 320 semi-structured interviews with women's rights holders and women's rights activists throughout the 10 districts of Rwanda. And Rwanda being a country, of course, that is very much affected by climate change. And I wanted to raise a few of the points that came out of this study on the gender impacts that the women raised. And the first one I wanted to mention was the issue of unpaid care work. We know that globally, women spend around 4.5 hours a day on unpaid care work, while men spend maybe an hour and 20 minutes. And of course, in countries like Rwanda, the gap might even be stronger. This means, for example, that in the effects of environment and climate crisis, where crop losses, for example, means that the family income is reduced. Men can leave their families and go and seek for a job elsewhere. Women are often bound to stay to take care of their families, take care of their elders, etc. Another issue that was mentioned was, of course, and we know this from other studies as well, how the climate crisis affects violence, and it affects gender-based violence. We saw a strong connection between the impact of climate change on community and family conflicts leading to violence. For example, young girls having to help out at home when, due to crop losses, for example, having to drop out of school early. We saw early marriages in the traces of increased poverty. We saw gender-based violence and rape increasing when women have to travel longer distances to fetch water. The women mentioned increased alcohol consumption by the men due to the stress following in the traces of environment and climate crisis, leading to both violence on community level, but also domestic abuse. When it comes to sexual and reproductive health, we also saw that, for example, there was an increased risk of sexually transmitted infections due to, for example, transsexual sex for survival. We saw increased early or unwanted pregnancies due to gender-based violence, sexual violence. We also saw increased family violence and gender-based violence due to women secretly trying to do family planning as a way to mitigate loss of income due to environment and climate crisis. So these are just a few things that we saw in this study that I think is worth mentioning. But I also wanted, before I end, to say a few words about, because we believe, of course, it's extremely important to have environment and climate crisis into the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and National Action Plan. It's also very important to get the gender aspects into the processes of environment and climate crisis. And we believe that the women's rights organizations are key in this work. But there is a few things that we still believe needs to be addressed because they are impeding the women's rights movement's engagement. One is the global trend of shrinking civic space and increased threats towards women's rights organizations, meaning that adding on an issue such as environment and climate crisis to what is already a pushback on women's rights means women have to, that it's a security concern, basically. And it's also the decreasing of civic space also makes it more and more difficult for women's rights organizations to act in any thematic area. The other one is we see, for example, in our with our partners in the Western Balkans, we see increasing pushback from international corporations. We have partners protesting against, for example, dams being built by international corporations with economic muscles that makes it possible for them to put our partner organizations, women's rights organizations, and environmental activists into court cases, which is very costly, and this affects both the families and the activists themselves, of course. We see funding. There's a new report, I think it's quite new, from UNDP that says that 10% of global financing for climate goes to community and local projects. 0.01% of global climate funding goes to projects that addresses both climate change and women's rights. And I should say also that I would say that the bulk of this money does not even go to women's rights organizations, but other organizations working on the topic. And then finally, participation. So we have partner organizations, for example, in the DRC that noticed that after floodings in the DRC some time ago, the government analysis of the effects on the population of the floodings had no gender aspect at all, which meant that there were no specific measures taken to address the gendered effects were there in the floodings. From our MENA report, we see that many of the women's rights organizations or activists that responded to our survey said that they had no influence over the NDCs of the countries, and there were no gendered perspective in the NDCs, the national contributions to the Paris Agreement. And this is due to these decisions being made. Charlotte. Yeah, I will finalize. Being made in parliaments where women don't have representation. But we do believe that the nexus of environment and climate crisis and women, peace and security can mutually benefit each other and strengthen each other. So I think this is a very important discussion to have, and we need to also step up our resources to fund the women's rights organizations that have the power to work on this issue. Thank you. Sorry for dragging on.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for expanding the scope of the discussion we have here today. Our third speaker is Dr. Jisoo Yoon. She is the director of the Center for International Development and Cooperation at the Korea Women's Development Institute, KWDI, in Seoul, South Korea. Jisoo received her PhD in political science from Penn State University in the United States, and prior to joining KWDI, she held academic positions at Uchanomizu University in Japan and the University of Kansas in the United States. She has published widely on women's political representation, gender and political behavior, and policy advocacy in South Korea and Japan. In 2023, she led a research project commissioned by the Minister of Gender Equality and Family in South Korea, evaluating the implementation of South Korea's UN Security Council Resolution 1325 National Action Plan, and suggested ways to advance women, peace and security agenda in the future through the National Action Plan. So with those words, Jisoo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mats, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Charlotte and Claire, for your analytical overview of this issue. I will talk more about South Korea's perspective of this gender and climate security issue. Before I begin, let me also briefly introduce about the Korean Women's Development Institute. We are a government-sponsored think tank with 41 years of history. And we are one of the 26 government-sponsored research think tanks that we research on issues related to gender equality, and we support government's policymaking in the area of gender equality. And we have engaged in research related to women, peace, and security, mainly by engaging in the background research before South Korean government adopted South Korea's 1325 national action plans. And so our first national action plan came, it was released 10 years ago. And so every time it was updated, researchers at KWDI has engaged in the background research to kind of review the implementation and then suggest ways for improvement. And so today I would like to begin by talking about how South Korea's existing national action plan or government strategies on development assistance, how we address this issue of gender and climate security. Well, let me first begin by talking about 1325 National Action Plan. Well, unfortunately, previous versions of South Korea's national action plans did not include any mentions of climate security. And so in our research conducted last year, in 2023 for the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in South Korea, where we reviewed the implementation process of the National Action Plan, we pointed out the importance of and growing significance of emerging threats like climate and cybersecurity in our research. And we did suggest that the upcoming National Action Plan in South Korea should include mentions of this issue. Well, so the fourth National Action Plan should be released soon for South Korea. It has not been released yet. And so we will have to find out to what extent exactly our new National Action Plan addresses this issue of climate security. But we hope that the National Action Plan goes beyond simply mentioning the importance of and the seriousness of the climate change. And we hope our National Action Plan goes a step further by committing to specific goals like South Korea strengthening international partnerships on this issue, as well as increased funding for emerging threats like climate and cybersecurity. But let me also mention another big improvement, like policy-wise. So South Korea's Office for Government Policy Coordination released Development Assistance Gender Equality Strategy and Implementation Guidelines just last month in April of 2024. This is quite meaningful because it's the first ever government-wide strategy on gender equality and development assistance. For South Korea, this is the first ever government-wide gender equality strategy on development assistance. And so this strategy lays out 3 priority areas, and one of the areas is increased support for women in conflict and fragile states. And specifically, the plan is to provide support for women in areas affected by climate change and natural disasters. And so such an emphasis on women, climate, and conflict in South Korea's government's official document, a so-called Gender Equality International Strategy and Guidelines. This is a big step forward for us. But of course, there is room for lots of improvement. And so while the new strategy highlights support for gender equality and to reduce damage to women and vulnerable groups in climate crisis and disaster situations, this document does not mention how the government's efforts will be monitored over time. And it does not list the priority countries and regions to receive South Korea's support. These priority areas are not identified. And finally, in what ways South Korea will commit resources and finance our efforts, this is also unclear. And so similarly related to South Korea's 1325 National Action Plan, and I mean, many of you here who have joined the webinar will know that some countries' national action plans focus on increased development and humanitarian assistance related to the WPS agenda in other parts of the world. And then the other countries' documents include support for women in conflict and vulnerable situations affected by climate crisis and natural disasters. And so many countries listed their priorities in this issue and included as part of their national action plan. You already know this. Well, South Korea has not had such a specific a document specifically listing goals and priorities in the 1325 National Action Plan so far. And so again, this is one way in which South Korea needs to improve when it comes to showing more commitment for gender and climate security. Well, so far, what are some of the lessons learned for us? I think the biggest lesson learned is that in order to promote gender and climate security and to really make change, the government should consistently and repeatedly demonstrate their efforts in every way possible. And so in the way of releasing strategy on gender and development assistance, in the way of releasing an updated 1325 National Action Plans, in the way of mainstreaming and to committing more funding related to gender equality in development and humanitarian assistance. And so all of this should be done in a related manner, not independently. And so why do I say this, that this is important? Well, in order for South Korea to become a global pivotal state and to understand to undertake leadership as the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council and to promote issues like women, peace and security, climate security, and cyber security, South Korea needs to show efforts not simply by talking about these issues, but really show commitment in every way possible. But after becoming a member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee in 2010, South Korea has indeed emerged as an important donor in the international community. And so South Korea is the 16th largest donor country as of 2022, and it aspires to become one of the top 10 in the near future. But at the same time, it has a long way to go before becoming a major donor of gender equality. 18% of South Korea's bilateral allocable ODA was reported as gender-focused or gender-related in 2022. This is far below the average of OECD DAC countries, which is 36. And so South Korea lacks visibility and power as a donor of gender equality. And this prevents and limits South Korea from asserting itself when promoting issues like gender and climate security, the agendas like gender and climate security internationally. And so the government's continued support for the broader cause is very important to advance this agenda. Next, I would like to talk a little bit more about the importance of global partnership. And so South Korea should definitely build onto and strengthen global partnerships in the area of gender and climate security. In our review, recent review conducted last year for the 1325 National Action Plan implementation, we found cases where South Korea has sponsored and supported women, peace, and security agenda in the Asia-Pacific region, specifically in assisting countries to adopt national action plans and to support and raise awareness on issues like cybersecurity. South Korea can do more and advance further in working in this area, and to keep on working closely with partners like UN Women, the Asia Pacific Office, who has both knowledge to identify needs in local areas and who has local networks to implement important agendas in the region. South Korea could also utilize and become a part of existing international platforms like the Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action. This and maybe Claire from UN Women could talk more about this later on in the Q&A, but this is, from what I understand, it's more or less like one of the action coalitions that was created following the Generation Equality Forum in 2021. And this compact invites different government and non-government partners to become signatories of the compact and to work together to fulfill a common goal. And I believe South Korea needs to become a part of such a global network and to work and to promote the agenda within the global partnership. So finally, I would like to also talk about the importance of engaging local communities and grassroots organizations in addressing gender and climate security. But I must also say that this is the kind of the toughest question to answer from my point of view, because while the policy community, policymakers in South Korea acknowledge and highlight the importance of engaging local communities, it's still a challenge and it's still quite difficult to implement in practice. And the reason is a deeper level of engagement and knowledge, as well as access to networks, local networks, is necessary to work with grassroots organizations and local communities. And I think this is particularly so in emerging issues like gender and climate security. But South Korea has been a major donor for only about 10 years. So for emerging donors like South Korea, that's still in the process of building that kind of networks and knowledge, identifying local needs and finding partners to work with is not such a simple task. And so South Korea could definitely benefit from a sharing of knowledge by more experienced experts and partners. And in this regard, I'd like to conclude that I appreciate once again this opportunity to meet and discuss on the theme of gender and climate security with more experienced experts like Charlotte and Claire. And I hope to discuss more during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jisoo, for providing us with the South Korean perspective as an emerging middle power and with a lot of interesting technologies from my side. We have about 15 minutes now for Q&A. Encourage our viewers to ask questions using the Q&A function at the Zoom app. But let me start. All three of you have mentioned the importance of partnerships, and understandably so. But so I would like to take that a little bit step further, and also combining it with, you have all mentioned the importance of funding and the lack of funding and resources to address these very complex and challenging issues. So I have two questions related to that. The first one, and that's a little bit, I take this also as a, from a position here in Sweden, where there is more and more talk about the importance of involving the private sector in climate-related issues. But none of you have mentioned the private sector when it comes to the nexus we are talking about, which is climate change, gender, and security. So is that because you don't see a role for the private sector, or is it because it is difficult to define a role, or we haven't really managed to yet involve the private sector in these issues? Because they come with technology and they come with fundings if we can get them to be constructive partners. So that's my first issue related to partnerships and funding. And the second one is, if you can give me or us an example of a successful partnership and its positive implications on a kind of concrete example. So those two questions. And please, if I may start with you, Claire.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. These are great questions, and I maybe my colleagues Charlotte and Iso will have more to say about the private sector. But in the consultations for developing this guidance paper that I was talking about, the private sector did not come out as a critical stakeholder, and not that they didn't come out as a critical stakeholder, but that they were not, I guess maybe their role wasn't clearly defined as how they come, as examples, I think, as concrete examples of what's been done. So basically what I'm trying to say is that there was no kind of key examples that came out during the consultations of how private sector has played a role in women, peace and security and climate change. And I completely agree that they have a very key role in this. But I think that I have not seen anyway in my work for this guidance paper any kind of example of how private sector has come in. And perhaps this is an area for the guidance paper to kind of explore a bit more. But perhaps the colleagues could maybe say a bit more about that. But in terms of partnerships that have really worked, one example comes to mind. I worked in Uganda for many years with UN Women, and I supported the government there more recently to develop and implement its 4th National Action Plan. And in this, we saw a really great thing happening where the partnerships were built from the very start of the design part of the National Action Plan. So what was seen previously in National Action Plans in Uganda was that critical ministries, departments and agencies such as the Ministry for Environment, Water, even the Ministry for Security or Internal Affairs or Foreign Affairs really knew nothing about women, peace and security, nor did they have any part to play in the previous national action plans. So what the government really wanted to do, the lead government agency, which is the Ministry of Gender, what they wanted to do was make sure that these actors, these stakeholders that play a critical role when it comes to peace and security are involved in the design of the National Action Plan. and that the National Action Plan speaks to the national priorities of those stakeholders. So from the very start, we met with each of these ministries at a very senior level to get their buy-in to be involved in the National Action Plan. And then they assigned focal points to actually help to write the National Action Plan. So then climate change obviously came out as a critical issue, because for them it's the #1 issue when it comes to peace and security. And that then translated into climate change coming through as an outcome in the National Action Plan, through to the monitoring and evaluation framework, and through to the budget. And then it went a step further, because they participated in the development of the National Action Plan, and they saw great value of having the NAP feeding into their national objectives in the National Development Plan. They then actually, each of these agencies asked for support in developing an operational plan that would reflect the National Action Plan, and would actually speak to specifically what that ministry or agency could do to implement it. And so in monitoring and evaluating the NAP as time is going on, we're seeing that the National Action Plan is actually being implemented and being funded as well, because it has such a link to the National Adaptation Plan of the country. It talks to the SDGs around climate change, the CEDAW recommendations, and so they're using practical instruments that have reporting mechanisms, and not creating anything new. And that actually was something critical that came up throughout my consultations recently, was the importance of not creating anything new, but working with existing mechanisms, and working with these mechanisms to integrate current policies and frameworks that exist, and building on these to bring out peace and security. And one of the critical elements of that is partnerships. And that's ensuring that security sector, the military, the disaster risk reduction mechanisms in the country actually see that they have a part to play. And once they see they have a part to play, it's more natural for them to come in and be part of the implementation of a National Action Plan. So I would say partnerships are really critical, and getting that right from the very outset is invaluable for the lifetime of a National Action Plan anyway. And so that's just my input on that. Over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And when you have a good time, time is flying, as we say. But I would like to give the floor to Charlotte and Jisoo also to ask this question about the role of, especially the role of the private sector. Is that something we need to kind of encourage and find incentives on bringing them more on board in order for them to be actively engaged, and also use the amount of funding and technology and resources they control? And there is also a question from one of our viewers. So if any one of you would like to touch upon that question from Lovelis, please do. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see the question. I can look at it later on, but for the private sector, I think definitely they are extremely important. I don't have that much to add, because we don't really work with them on this topic. We support women's rights organizations, and they often have very little contacts with the private sector. What we do know is we do work from like a more method perspective with some parts of private sector, to make sure that when they invest in other countries, that their investments do not bring on gender-based violence. So I think when it comes to private sector and technology and investments, extremely important to then also have the gender perspective, because I think often that is lacking. When it comes to partnerships, I believe, because I come from the civil society side, I believe that the partnership between the environmental movement and the feminist movement is extremely important. And I think that I know that in many countries, they are quite siloed, also because funding is siloed. At the same time, we know that many of the activists at the forefront of the environment sector are also women. So, but not necessarily then having a gender agenda at the first forefront. So I think building opportunities for the feminist movement and the environmental movement to meet and discuss and share knowledge and build capacity one to the other and vice versa is extremely important. And I also want just to finally to say that there is quite good research that shows, or not quite good, there is substantial research that shows that if we want to have advancements on gender issues, such as legislation, for example, then the feminist movement is the single one most important actor. It's more important than even having women in parliament, even though that's of course also crucial. But the funding of women's rights organizations is crucial also in environmental and climate crisis issues. So I want to stress that again.
Thank you, Charlotte. Jisoo, any thoughts about this, about involving, I mean, you have a lot of very successful major corporations in South Korea that sits on a abundance of resources and knowledge and technology that, at least from my perspective, could help advance this issue about climate change, the impact, and gender and security. Do you have any comments and insights on that, Jisoo?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I have thought about this since you raised the question, but there's no good example that I could point to as like a case that we could showcase, an example to showcase as an example of engaging the private sector successfully. But I think the thing is, it's not that it's impossible, or it's not that it's uninteresting. It's just that climate security is such a new issue for us, surprisingly. Climate security, new issue. Gender and climate security, even newer. It's still, people find it still unheard of. Many people have unheard about this. And so that's one of the reasons why we can't find good examples so far. But the attention to climate security is building up very quickly within South Korea. And so I think there is a lot of potential for private sector engagement. And so really, we hope to be able to talk about a good example of this in the near future. Yeah, that's my short answer to the question.
Yeah, thank you, Jisoo. We have one question from one of our viewers. Maybe I can address this to you, Claire. It's about from Lovelise working with the UNDP in Sudan. And she is asking if one way to promote the issue we are talking about would also be to building on what is something she called national determined contributions as another platform to highlight the intersection of gender and climate factor and foster collaboration among stakeholders. Any thoughts and comments on that, Claire?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great opportunity, and really, while national action plans are a very practical and relevant tool to integrate climate change into women, peace and security, there are many other entry points. And while in one country and that might be relevant, in another country it might not be relevant. And so finding as many entry points as possible is really important. And that could be a national adaptation plan. It could be a national policy or framework that's relevant to climate change or climate peace and security. And it can be these NDCs. as a platform to really highlight, as you say, Lovelace, the intersection of gender and climate factors. And in 2025, when the revision of that cycle comes, in the build up to that just like you say, it is a great opportunity to strengthen those linkages. So there's really no one entry point. What I'm hearing is that there are so many different entry points for this, and it's critical that we find as many as possible. And Matt, if I can just mention, I was thinking through the question on private sector, and I remembered a point that came up. If I might just kind of add to this, I know it was your previous question, but one point that I remember in Uganda, the private sector played a role in the development of the National Action Plan there, and what was really important and what was really critical was, because there are so many issues that relate to the private sector and private sector companies, whether it's to do with mining or extractive industries, whether it's to do with the many different land grabbing and corporate accountability, the private sector really can contribute to efforts by respecting environmental and human rights standards and supporting local communities in climate adaptation and peace building. So they play a really strong role, but they also play a role as a stakeholder in national action plans and other policy frameworks by being involved in the coordination of these plans. So being an actor at the table and feeding into the conversation, as well as ensuring that they play a role in climate policies and plans that exist. So ensuring that private sector are involved as much as possible in consultations and coordination mechanisms is really critical, given the role that they play. So I just reflected a bit on that, and I thought I'd share that. Back to you, Mats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you also to Charlotte and Jiso. I said in my introduction that we have 3 fantastic speakers, and I think you all agree that we have had the privilege of listening to 3 fantastic speakers with different backgrounds and experiencing from trying to promote the issue of both climate change, the impact of climate change, and gender issues and security in this nexus. And I'm sure we will have we need to get back to these issues and explore further both the opportunities, use the benchmarking for the positive examples, and also work around some of the conflicts of interest that exist in this issue as well. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to KWDI for cooperating with us, setting this up. And thank you to our viewers. And look for more information on both KWDI's homepage and ours for the next upcoming events. Thank you very much, and have a lovely Friday afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.